Darkcast Network. Out of the shadows come the best indie podcasts.
Hey everyone, welcome to True Crime California. I'm your host Cindy, and I'm glad you're here. Hey guys, we're back with part 2 of the tale of Dorothea Puente. I have a little vocal fry and I'm really paranoid about it because I hear all of these reviews of podcasts or people talking about them like, I can't stand their vocal fry. And I'm like, I don't think people realize how much vocal fry you get when you're talking this much. Like, you can drink water, you can like do whatever you want to do, like try to project, and like you just have it. It just happens sometimes. And I get really paranoid about it. Also, I'm getting a little sick. My son has had the flu for like 5 days, which is unheard of for him. And he's passing it on to me, which I'm really excited about because tomorrow's my birthday and I think I'm going to wake up with a fever. So that's going to be really cool. Anyway, my dogs are in the bed with me being loud and crazy and making this very difficult, as they do every time I record, which is just so fun. Anyway, I guess this is maybe like my little energy surge before I go down with the flu. So this is part 2 of Dorothea Puente. I actually recorded some of it when I was doing part 1 before I realized like, hey, this is going to have to be 2 episodes. So I'm going to sort of just like pop it in. And as a reminder, Dorothea had just been released on her own recognizance from jail, meaning she couldn't afford to pay the bail, but the judge just let her out, assuming she would show up for the court date. This was for the poisoning of an 82-year-old woman. And then the man, Malcolm McKenzie, who she robbed him of his pinky ring while he was staring at her immobilized because she had poisoned him. So she is going to go to trial for those things, but she is out and able to sort of live her life before she goes in front of a judge. And while she is out and free, she plans and executes the first murder for profit that she's going to do a lot of these. And this is like the first one. Now, I know with Esther Bugsby in the previous episode, Esther did die about a year after Dorothea stopped poisoning her. And it is thought that potentially part of why she died was because of the poisonings, but that is not really attributed to her as like an actual murder. So we're going to talk about her first murder while she is out on bail. While out on bail, Dorothea wasted no time trying to find her next victim. And while at a bar, you'll never believe, she met another man. However, this man, Harold Monroe, was actually married and was also dying of terminal cancer. He was also a crazy alcoholic. Before he got too sick, he introduced Dorothea to his wife, Ruth Monroe. Ruth and Dorothea got along very well and quickly decided to go into business together. Dorothea was working as a cook at the bar, again, like trying to be on the straight and narrow for a minute. And they decided to start a catering business together. I guess Ruth had experience on the business side, so they figured they could work together and make some money. Now, the first thing that Dorothea did was she convinced Ruth to open a joint bank account and to move all of her savings into this joint account to help open the business. And this was like some thousands of dollars. She also had Ruth move into the house at 1426 F Street since her husband was now in hospice at the VA hospital. Ruth had a lot of friends in the area as well as 4 grown children with whom she spent nearly every Sunday. But for whatever reason, I think Dorothea charmed her. She did that thing and she got her in her web. One Sunday, a few months after she'd moved in, on April 24th, 1982, while at the beauty parlor, Ruth saw one of her many friends and told her that she was so sick she thought she might die. She said she couldn't go to the doctor because she couldn't even remember eating dinner or going to bed. The friend later said she appeared dazed, scared, and had no idea what was going on. Ruth rushed out of the parlor saying she was going to go get into bed. Prior to this, Ruth had always been a happy, vibrant person, full of life, full of love, so this was really scary for her friend. And it was really scary for her kids who would come to visit her at F Street and started to notice that even though Ruth never really drank before, they would find her drinking a green liquid, which she said was creme de menthe, and that Dorothea was giving it to her to calm her nerves over the state of her husband and her marriage. Now, on the night of April 24th, which was the same day that her friend saw her at the beauty parlor, Ruth's son came over to F Street to check on his mother and found her in quite a state. Dorothea quickly rushed him out of the house, saying that she would care for Ruth. The next 2 days, her kids came by or would call, but were constantly turned away by Dorothea, saying Ruth was being seen by doctors and that she had just been given a shot to help her sleep, so she couldn't be disturbed. Then, around 5:30 a.m. on April 28th, Ruth's daughter Rosie got a call from Dorothea saying to hurry over and that she had called the paramedics as Ruth wasn't responding. When Rosie got to the house, Dorothea was in tears and told her her mother had died. Dorothea told the paramedics that Ruth had a heart condition, but nobody knew about that. She also kind of hinted that she may have overdosed, which is weird because, like, wouldn't she have said that when she called 911? Ruth's body was taken for autopsy and some weird stuff was found, which I think is what Dorothea was trying to set them up for. Like, oh, maybe she OD'd, trying to get ahead of it. First, it looked as though she hadn't eaten in days. The only thing in her stomach was creme de menthe. Second, her liver was enlarged and had fatty damage to it, like she had a fatty liver, meaning either alcoholism or poisoning. Now, Ruth, as I said, rarely drank, to the point that her kids were surprised to see her with the creme de menthe, so it definitely was not alcoholism. Samples were sent for testing and came back with lethal amounts of codeine in Ruth's system. Now, also Tylenol, because it's like a Tylenol codeine is how they used to prescribe it. But it was the codeine that did it. Even though there was enough Tylenol in her system to also kill her, it was a pretty gnarly combo. Her death was ruled undetermined because suicide wasn't ruled out. And shockingly, she didn't have the codeine prescribed to her. I bet we all know who did, though. The family got together and finally someone said, hey, I suspect Dorothea killed Ruth. And the family was split on this, but the ones who agreed with that went to police. Without evidence, though, Dorothea again escaped any punishment for her crimes. In fact, because the police said there was no proof, some of the kids went back to believing their mother had killed herself, citing the failure of her marriage, her husband's illness, and her hatred of aging. Immediately after Ruth's death, Dorothea emptied their joint bank account and bought a plane ticket to Mexico, because she knew the heat was on. She knew the kids were onto her, and she thought it was a good time to get out of Dodge. Before leaving for Mexico, though, she did something so stupid that it makes me wonder if she actually wanted to be caught. Dorothea decided to call her friend who she'd known for about a year, a woman named Dorothy who lived nearby, and asked to come over. Dorothea was drunk and upset about Ruth and talked about how she was being accused by the family and how the cops were bothering her. And Dorothy just kind of sat there and listened and was like, this is kind of fucking crazy. She then mixed Dorothy a drink, after which Dorothy passed out. When she woke up, some of her checks were gone and she found an empty pill bottle and some red liquid in the blender that Dorothea had used to mix her drink. Now, she had only mixed Dorothy a drink, and when Dorothy said, aren't you going to drink with me? Dorothea replied, I'm only drinking vodka. So she was like drinking straight vodka, but of course had time to mix a drink for her friend. Now, Dorothy took this liquid, scooped it into the prescription bottle, and called the police. She knew who Dorothea was and gave them her name, and Dorothea had also told her plan to flee to Mexico. She was like, she drugged me, she robbed me, she lives at, 1426 F Street, she's trying to go to Mexico. Dorothea was arrested on May 19th and had Dorothy's checks on her when she was taken into custody. She ended up, for this, getting 5 years in prison as part of a plea deal that she first declined before she realized that the DA had information on Esther Busby. After the DA brought that up, she quickly agreed to 5 years and went to do her time. While in prison, the family of Ruth Monroe called the DA and said, hey, We think that she maybe killed our mother. Seeing her go to prison for drugging and robbing people was all it took to bring the family together on that subject. But unfortunately, at this time, there wasn't much to be done about it due to lack of evidence. But we will come back to this later. Dorothea did her time in prison and was released early, once again for good behavior and work credits, in 1985. And I want to say that good behavior and work credits are absolutely not an indicator of your chances for reoffending, obviously. While in prison, she started a pen pal relationship with 77-year-old Everson Gilmuth, who went by Gil, and he lived in Oregon and got about $700 a month in Social Security and pension money combined. He also owned an Airstream in which he lived, and he lived on his sister's property in Oregon, and he also had a really nice new red Ford pickup truck. The two entered into a relationship while Dorothea was still in prison, and on her release in August 1985, Everson, I guess I should call him Gil, was there waiting for her in his nice red truck. Gil had been widowed and is that the word for it? Widowed? He's a widower. And had been looking to get remarried ever since his wife died. I have no idea why, but he chose to write to multiple women in prison to try to find his next wife. I'm not really sure what that's about, but that's how he went about finding his next wife, and that's how he met Dorothea. Now, the two had already agreed to live together in the upstairs unit at 1426 F Street, which she had kept up rent payments on by allowing Ricardo to cash her Social Security checks while she was locked up. She also fooled Ricardo and Gil into thinking her crimes were far less serious than they were, which again is sort of her MO, and as long as it works, she's going to keep lying. Everson's sister was actually able to read up on Dorothea because remember at one point she was like a socialite that went to prison, and then she goes in for 5 years again. So she's very worried about Gil going to live with Dorothea, and she even went as far as calling the Sacramento police when she hadn't heard from him for a few days, which I'm going to say right now was a very, very smart move. Unfortunately, the timing was off. So in this instance, he was still alive and well, and he was really upset with his sister for doing this and basically called her and told her to fuck off. It was actually the last time they ever spoke, which is really, really sad. From there, his sister did keep trying to get in touch, but with no luck. Probably because her calling the cops pissed off and spooked Dorothea, who moved up the timeline on her plan. Now, eventually, his sister, whose name was Reba, received a letter from Gil saying he and Dorothea were to be married. And then shortly after this letter, Dorothea wrote her a letter saying something similar and that Gil was going to Palm Springs to sell his woodworkings. Shortly after that, she got a mailgram from Gil, supposedly Gil, saying he was leaving Dorothea and moving south. She received another one saying he was marrying another woman altogether. This terrified her because a mailgram is typed, so there's no way to prove who sent the letter because there's no handwriting. But she'd already checked on Gil once. It didn't go over well. So while she was worried about her brother, she basically left it alone. And I want to call out that during these following months, she would receive these mailgrams occasionally from a woman named Irene, who said that she was Gil's new wife-to-be and would give intermittent updates on Gil. But she never actually talked to Gil again, and she never even got another mailgram from him. She also said that it seemed like all of these mailgrams were being written by the same person, and that they matched the first letter sent to her by Dorothea, which makes sense. Meanwhile, back at F Street, Ricardo Orurica is still living in the downstairs part of the house, and he really grew to like Gil, who puttered around carving wood and enjoying his days while Dorothea seemingly doted over him. Ricardo had planned to go to Mexico to see his family around Christmas 1985, and before he did, he noticed that Gil's health was starting to decline ever so slightly. Nothing major, he's older, he's 77 or 78, but he seemed to start having heart issues that sometimes bothered him. Nothing out of the ordinary, we'll say. So Ricardo kind of keeps this in mind, and then he leaves for Mexico for the holiday, and upon his return in January 1986, he found that there was no Gil anywhere. Dorothea just basically said, oh, it didn't work out, he went back to Oregon. And And Ricardo was like, oh, that's a bummer. And that was kind of it. Now, a few months prior, in September, she had hired a man to help around the house. This man, Ismael Flores, was now driving Gil's truck in January. And according to Dorothea, this is because Gil had sold it to him before leaving. She said he also sold off his Airstream, and that was kind of the end of that as far as Ricardo was concerned, because again, he trusts and believes Dorothea. Now, as for Ismael, he had met Dorothea, it's gonna shock you where, in a bar, which is her favorite place to meet people. She offered him a job doing handyman work around the house, and he did things like painting, gardening, and building things for her from time to time. Now, at one point in mid-December, she asked him to build her a box about 6 feet high by 2 to 3 feet wide. Like a coffin? She said she needed it for storage for books and random items she wanted to hold on to, but also wanted to get out of the house. And of course, she can't just go, buy some cardboard boxes at like a moving supply place. Like, she's got to have him build her a fucking coffin. So Ismael, he just did as he was asked. He built her this box. Then once she had filled it with books, i.e. Gil, Ismael loaded it into the red Ford truck he now owned because she'd already sold it to him, and she actually gave it to him for a discounted price in return for his work, which is so messed up, and had him drive her to take it to storage. On the way, Dorothea was like, you know what? I actually just want to get rid of this stuff. Can you just dump it on the side of the road by the river? So he did. He was just like, sure, I'll go push it down on the riverbank. And I think Dorothea's hope was that the water would rise and take the box away. Later on, Ismael went to sell the truck, but he didn't have a bill of sale. So he took it to Dorothea, who forged Gil's signature, saying, it's mine. He gave it to me. And Ismael was kind of like, oh, okay. And so he's just a trusting man? I don't really know. On New Year's Day, Everson Gilmouth's body was found in the box in the river by a man fishing. Sadly, the body was too decomposed to determine a cause of death or even figure out who it was, so it was filed as a John Doe in Sutter County, which is near Sacramento County. And that was it for a while for poor Gil, who also was found with a bunch of garbage in the box. So that's the kind of person Dorothea is. Meanwhile, Dorothea is definitely still cashing his pension and Social Security checks, but Gil is no more. From here, Dorothea again opened a boarding house, despite her parole specifically forbidding this. Ricardo didn't mind and eventually even moved out of the house, allowing Dorothea to take it over entirely and rent out the rooms under the radar of the government or her parole officer, because, again, she's not allowed to be doing this. They have no idea what she's doing. According to her parole officer, she's just renting a room, but in fact, she's turning this into another boarding house, which I'm going to tell you right now becomes a house of horrors. Again, she took in many alcoholics and elderly, but did not provide care in the way she had previously. Instead, all she did was basically feed them and do their laundry, but otherwise mostly left them to their own devices, with one very unsurprising caveat. They were not allowed to open their own mail. Dorothea had control over that and would open all their checks and cash them and give each one a very small allowance. Now, Dorothea had quite a few people coming in and out of the house, and at one point she linked up with someone who helped place unwanted people and who obviously didn't know who she was. So she was giving her alcoholics, people with mental health issues, people that were just difficult to place and who were in need of care. And this woman sent Dorothea 3 or 4 people over the months between 1987 and 1988. And we will talk about all of them, but right now I want to focus on the one who I think was brought into her from 2 social workers. And this is kind of the start of Dorothea's downfall. This man's name was Alvaro Bert Montoya. He was 51 and had lived the last 5 years in a detox center, but was not able to stay sober. He was kind of sent to Dorothea as a way of minimizing harm to himself. They were like, okay, he's not going to stop drinking. We can't keep control of him. We'll give him to her. And, she seems to have a way with people, so we'll just let him live there. Now, Bert was a mentally ill, but also very sweet and very harmless man. The danger he posed was only to himself due to suicidal thoughts, hearing voices and not being able to care for himself. He said that he would often hear his father, who had died, telling him to kill himself so that they could be together. So he's definitely very, very mentally ill, but he's not wanting to hurt anyone else. And he was very well liked by everybody that knew him. The two social workers who brought him to Dorothea were at first really happy with how things were going. Bert had gained some weight, he was clean and showered, he had nice clothing, and he seemed to be taking his meds. So Dorothea was definitely giving him a higher level of care. And she even allowed him to drink a little bit and had set a tab up at the nearby bar so that he could go have a few beers and eat a burrito every week, like once or twice a week, basically. He led a simple life and seemed to thrive under Dorothea's care, at least at first. After just a few months of being with Dorothea in April 1988, Bert came back to the detox center and said that Dorothea had been drugging him. He stayed the night and said he didn't want to go back because she made him do all sorts of work and was not nice to him. But because he was mentally ill and because they didn't have good resources, the social workers convinced him to go back to Dorothea, which he did the next day. And I want to say that this is a big problem for, in the mental health field. People will say things like this, and if they have, schizophrenia or kind of a history of making things up, they're not going to be taken seriously. And the problem with that is, in this instance, this is a great, example of when they need to be taken seriously. But it's very difficult to know what is real and what isn't. And so I think, especially when in situations like this, they just did the best they could. And they're like, go back. We see that you're fine. There's no reason for you to not be there. So he goes back to Dorothea and she's pissed. Obviously, this is a close call, especially considering her barely hidden past. So she's got to lock him down. Bert remained with her for a few more months, with Dorothea cashing his checks, giving him this small allowance. And he started to kind of get a little more out of control. I think because he wasn't happy there. At one point in July 1988, Bert got a hold of some extra money by recycling some cans and got himself real drunk. This, again, really pissed Dorothea off, as she hated drunks despite being one herself. This is another part of her self-loathing psychology, which is super weird. Then in August 1988, Bert went to the bar, had a beer and a burrito, and then collapsed on the ground. He was carried back to F Street, where Dorothea was very worried about him. Yeah, right. And then on August 24th, Dorothea caught him drinking in the street. So at this point, she's getting sick of him. Obviously, his drinking one beer and collapsing, she's starting to poison him. And after the 24th of August, she was done with him. He was never seen again after that. Luckily, this man, unlike many of her difficult, wayward, lost soul tenants, as I mentioned, was very well liked and looked after by these two social workers, and anybody else who knew him really liked him. So when he missed a doctor's appointment on August 29th, the social workers were notified and came to find out what was going on. Dorothea told them that Bert had gone to Mexico to see her family, which she does not have. So this is just a crazy fucking lie. Like I said, during this time, she was cashing all her tenants' checks and even posing as them to get her hands on their prescriptions, which included sedatives, of course, antipsychotics, and other hardcore pharmaceuticals. Anyway, so the social workers keep trying to get a hold of Bert, and Dorothea kept saying, he's in Mexico, he'll be back soon. Finally, one of them said, just before November, we need to see him by the 1st or he's going to lose all of his benefits, which obviously is going to be a problem for Dorothea because she wants the money to keep coming in. Dorothea promised he'd be back by then, but of course, he wasn't. She said his brother took him to Utah or somewhere before she could have him check in with them. Finally, the social workers are like, fuck this. They call the cops and they ask them to check it out. And shockingly, the cops did come and check it out. It's mid-November at this point, and the cops go to 1426 F Street, and they ask Dorothea if they can speak with Bert. Dorothea said, he's with his brother or brother-in-law, and one of her tenants who was interviewed said the same thing. Now, when this tenant was done talking to police, he was like, hold on a second, and he handed them a piece of paper. Now, the cops go downstairs, and they read this, And on this piece of paper, it said, "She's making me lie to you." So the cops then find a way to meet up with this tenant, and he met them down the street and told them he hadn't seen Bert in months. Now, also around this time, Dorothea had employed a number of prisoners from a minimum security sort of halfway house to come do work for her in her yard. This included digging a lot of holes in trenches and sometimes filling them up with concrete, like the following day kind of thing. She would pay them hourly for their work and gave them extra money to keep their mouths closed about exactly what they were doing in the yard. None of them knew why, but they all agreed, because why wouldn't they? Before the cops were called, one of the social workers received a call from a man claiming to be Bert's brother-in-law, saying he'd taken him to Shreveport, Utah, which very much is not a place. Shreveport is in Louisiana. And when the social worker asked to speak with Bert, this man refused. This turned out to be one of those inmates, which is so bold of Dorothea to do that and not expect to get caught. Like, what is she thinking? So anyway, she has these inmates doing all this like unscrupulous work for her. Just bold. She's so bold, if nothing else. So the cops show up and they're like, okay, Bert's not here. We have this tenant saying that she paid him to lie to us. We need to get to the bottom of this. So they show back up and they ask her, hey, can we look around and can we dig in your yard? And again, this request didn't come from nowhere. They had been watching Dorothea and waiting for her to slip up since Ruth Monroe's death. Like, remember, the family went to the police and said, we think she killed our mom. And the police strongly agreed with this, but again, they had no proof. So now they've got this call about Bert, and they're like, all right, we're going to take this. You know, and they didn't downplay or ignore the call because they had so many other things on her. So her cute little lady act is no longer working. Now, while they're at the house and before they start digging in the yard, they did mention to her, like, hey, you're going to go back to jail for running this boarding house because this is a parole violation. And they said that she was like really calm about that and was like, okay, no problem. Totally understand. They then asked, you know, can we dig in the yard? And she straight up said yes. She was like, yeah, go ahead. Her defense later included, this is so silly. If I killed someone and buried them in my yard, why would I tell you to go ahead and dig there? So it's sort of like, again, she's trying to get ahead of it, but she's so fucking dumb. And she does dumb things really often. And the problem, I think, is that she got away with doing dumb things a lot and making dumb lies, and people just like either ignored it or believed her. So this emboldened her to keep doing this kind of shit. So now the cops are looking through her house. They find not only a number of pill bottles of people no longer living with Dorothea and with unknown whereabouts, they also find in her yard a number of bones. Now, at first, they're unsure of what kind of bones, maybe animal. And it wasn't until they found a shoe with a foot inside that they felt confident that they were finding human bodies. Now remember, as far as they know, they're only looking for Bert Montoya, and the shoe, foot, and body that went with it were too decomposed to be Bert's. So that was very concerning for them. Dorothea was then detained and the grounds were secured. She was interviewed for hours and told so many lies. Like, I actually watched one of these. You can go to archive.org and watch her interviews. And it's a 40-minute interrogation, and the lies she told were endless. She once again said she had family in Mexico, that Ricardo was her cousin or nephew, yet she had no idea what the bodies were doing there, and of course, her amazing defense of why would I incriminate myself like that. Now, after she was interviewed, she was allowed to go back home since the body was not that of Bert, and there was no proof that Dorothea had actually put that body there. So, I mean, they know, but they can't prove it. So they're like, all right, lady, go home. You can't really go anywhere. We're securing the location. We're going to start digging. So the police kind of stay there overnight, and they resume their digging first thing the next morning. Meanwhile, upstairs, Dorothea and one of her tenants she didn't seem to want to kill, Mervyn John Macaulay, were getting ready to leave the premises. Dorothea told him she needed to get away and asked that he accompany her to the hotel down the street where Ricardo worked. He agreed, helping her pack up the money and items that she might need. She's kind of basically, we know, she's going to make her escape. I want to note that while he dug holes and did chores for her, this man didn't seem to have any idea of what she was up to. And she wasn't at this point under arrest, so he didn't really do anything wrong in this situation, at least not like legally speaking. And I will say that he was arrested later, as was Ismail, the like her house, the carpenter guy that she hired around the house. As far as I know, neither of them actually saw any jail time because they didn't actually do anything. They were just kind of idiots. So Dorothea gets dressed and she goes downstairs and she's wearing this like this red coat and this cute dress. And she goes downstairs to the detectives and she's like, hey, can I just go get a cup of coffee at my nephew's hotel where he works down the street? The police didn't really want to let her go, but at the same time, they hadn't really found any other bodies. They had nothing to really hold her, and she's not under arrest. So they're like, okay, yeah, you can just go get coffee, just come back, hurry back. And one of the detectives even walked her to the curb or to her car so she could get to the hotel. I think she walked, but there's a photo of him like walking her off the premises. It's like a famous photo because the cops fucked this up so bad. Like, how did they let her go? And they got absolutely like torn apart, in the community, and, the newspapers were like, idiot fucking cops, like, what are they doing? So anyway, she leaves and she and John get to the hotel where Ricardo, her not family member, is not working. From there, she calls a cab and uses the $3,000 she has in stolen money to get herself out of the city, going all the way down to Los Angeles. And it's a good thing for her that she left when she did, because cops found another body about 10 minutes later and went looking for her at the hotel. Of course, it was too late. Now let's go ahead and talk about the bodies they found. We're going to start with 78-year-old Betty Palmer. She was a reclusive woman who landed at 1426 F Street in the fall of 1986. She and Dorothea did not get along as Betty was hard-headed and secretive and did not like Dorothea telling her what to do. Within just a few months of her living there, Dorothea had already stolen her identity, getting an ID card with Betty's name and Dorothea's photo. She also cashed over $7,000 in Social Security checks of Betty's, mostly after she was killed. Sometime in late 1986, John McCauley, Mervyn, was asked to dig a hole in the front yard by Ricardo Orderica, which he did. Ricardo also didn't know what was going on, but Dorothea had asked him to do it, so he asked John McCauley. The next day, he was told to fill it back in with dirt. This is where Betty's body was found, missing her head and hands, which, by the way, were never found. They had been taken off to make it more difficult for her to be identified. So this is really fucked up. And Dorothea placed a statue of St. Francis of Assisi over her, which just feels like adding insult to injury. The next victim we're going to talk about was another 78-year-old, Leona Carpenter, who came to stay with Dorothea in December of 1986. Now, Leona was an alcoholic and prescription drug abuser who was an acquaintance of Dorothea's from the neighborhood. In October of 1986, a few months before she came to live with Dorothea, Leona ended up in the hospital after an apparent overdose on downers. I think it was actually like Dalmane, which doctors believed may have been intentional. So she was potentially suicidal. During this time, like I said, Leona was not yet living with Dorothea, but Dorothea was still able to gain power of attorney over Leona while she was in the hospital, which is quite a feat and says a lot about Dorothea's ability to manipulate. She straight up brought a notary to Leona's hospital bed while she was on death's door and had Leona give her power of attorney so she could start cashing her Social Security checks. Leona was in the hospital for a couple of months before being released in mid-December, at which point she went and lived with Dorothea. As you can imagine, she ended up back in the hospital shortly, suffering from yet another overdose. She went home again to Dorothea in February and promptly disappeared. Her body was found in the corner of the yard, and brain tissue samples showed she had overdosed on multiple prescription drugs, including codeine. So there's that one again. And what's crazy is that Dorothea called a plumber to take a look at some pipes right around the time that Leona went missing. The plumber had to dig a big hole, which was left open overnight, and this hole is where Leona's body was found. meaning that this very well could have been like a crime of opportunity. Obviously, she's killing people and she's probably going to kill Leona, but the timing could have had to do with her being like, look at that nice big hole that I didn't have to pay anybody to dig, or that I myself didn't have to dig. It would be terrible to put that hole to waste. And so she took this as the time to murder this poor old woman. The next victim was 62-year-old James Gallup, who had moved in with Dorothea after having surgery, or just before having surgery, of a benign tumor in his brain. James was an alcoholic who smoked 2 to 3 packs of cigarettes a day, and as a result, as you can imagine, was not in great health, but not anywhere near death by any means at this point. Dorothea took over medicating him and used his prescriptions for Dalmane to over-medicate him, as well as other tenants. Dorothea and James didn't really get along, and at one point they got into a heated argument after James told Dorothea she could not be the payee on his SSI checks. So she wanted to be listed as the payee on his Social Security checks, and he was like, absolutely not. Like, I'm going to control my money. I'll give you what I owe you. And we all know how Dorothea feels about that. So as you can imagine, he went missing very shortly after this argument. Now, what's interesting is he was actually scheduled for another cancer surgery as his doctor had found more tumors in his colon, but he disappeared before he could go in. Dorothea told people who had asked that he went to Los Angeles or that he simply disappeared, and she even told one person that he died and she had him cremated. So just a string of lies. Meanwhile, he's buried under the gazebo in her yard. And what's interesting is he had friends. Like, he had a friend at the local bar, a bartender, who, while he was in the hospital for his brain surgery, he called her to like check in and be like, I haven't been at the bar because I've been in the hospital. I don't want you to think I would just disappear, without saying goodbye. So this friend, when he did disappear without saying goodbye, she knew something was fishy, and she actually later testified in the trial. Now, the next victim is Vera Faye Martin. She came to live with Dorothea in October of 1987. She was placed by a worker who didn't know that Dorothea shouldn't have boarders. I maybe mentioned her previously. I've been recording this over several days, so I apologize. I also have the flu, so I'm very out of it. So if I repeated that, I apologize. But there was a worker who didn't know that Dorothea shouldn't have boarders, tenants, and so she was giving her difficult to place people. Vera, of course, met with the same fate as the others, very sadly, and Dorothea continued to cash her checks while she lay buried in the yard. About a month after Vera came to live with Dorothea, the same worker placed 65-year-old Dorothy Miller in the F Street house. Dorothy was a paranoid alcoholic who got in trouble for petty theft just after moving in with Dorothea. That being said, she was sort of the liaison between Dorothea and the tenants who lived downstairs. So Dorothea very much ruled over the house, sort of like a queen. And she was upstairs, and her closest, advisors were kind of allowed in the upstairs area, and then all of her subjects had to stay downstairs. And somehow Dorothy kind of was able to work her way into getting invited upstairs. She certainly wasn't like up there all the time, although I do think at one point before she disappeared, she was moved to the upstairs room, but I believe that was more so that Dorothea could kill her more easily, like medicating her and keeping her out of sight of the other tenants. But anyway, I found it interesting that she sort of became not a confidant, but she had a good enough relationship with Dorothea that she sort of was like the representative of the people of the house. However, when she disappeared, Dorothea, of course, used the excuse, oh, she got in trouble for stealing, she's back in jail, I kicked her out of the house, we'll never see her again. Dorothy, of course, was also found in the yard. Now, around this time that Dorothy went missing, one of the inmates that she hired to do that yard work was asked to clean the upstairs room where Dorothy had previously been sleeping. He later said he found large, foul-smelling stains in the room, which looked like slime. This was almost certainly vomit from Dorothy being poisoned, and I should mention at this time that more than one of Dorothea's victims were still alive when they were buried. And I believe Dorothy was one of them. She actually showed signs of trying to dig her way out of the grave, which is absolutely fucked up and horrifying. Also, around the time she went missing, Dorothea turned up at a hospital posing as Dorothy and asking for refills on a bunch of heavy sedative medications, all prescribed to Dorothy. So she is stealing money and identities. She has no plans to stop this craziness. The next victim was 55-year-old Benjamin Fink, a severe alcoholic who lived to drink, is what I read, and had health issues as a result. He lived with Dorothea for about 2 months before he went missing. Now, during this time, his brother visited him weekly, but even so, at least at first, his brother wasn't super suspicious when he went missing, because apparently Benjamin would drink heavily and then black out and go and wander away, and would end up in the hospital with unknown injuries. So at least at first, Dorothea sort of flew under the radar on this one, but when he was found in the yard, that kind of put an end to that. So that sums up all of the victims. And to be clear, there were a lot of other people who lived in the house that did not end up getting killed by Dorothea. A lot of them had probably been drugged, maybe didn't realize it. I know Mervyn John Macaulay, she was drugging him. So she definitely was hurting everyone. But those are the people that actually died. Now, like I said, there were a lot of other things happening, poisoning people, whatever. One of those things included Dorothea stealing her quote-unquote friend's checks after framing her for fraud and getting her thrown back in jail. So Dorothea and this woman, Brenda Trujillo, had met in prison and became friends, which is a funny word for anybody Dorothea had in her life. For whatever reason, though, Dorothea had confided in this woman about some of the murders, and it later came out during her trial that she confided in multiple other inmates, which is the worst fucking idea, but also I'm glad she did. But she told Brenda, I murder them, I drug them, I steal their checks, and then after she did this to Brenda, got her in trouble. I think what she did was drugged her, and then she ended up failing a drug test because Dorothea drugged her, and then she ended up back in jail. And Dorothea kept cashing her checks. So she filed a complaint saying, this woman did this to me, but it ended up on the back burner until Dorothea was arrested. But Brenda did testify in her trial. But before we get into the trial, which I'm just going to kind of gloss over because I find trials boring and I hate to say it's just not really my thing. I'm not that podcast. But before we get into that, let's talk about Dorothea's escape, which I sort of started, I think, some of this with. So I think I left off where she ran away from LA, which is wild and hilariously bold. I mean, this woman is pure evil, but I do respect that level of boldness that she has to just go for it over and over. And it did keep working out. So I understand why that made her feel like she could just keep running away and doing whatever and making it work. So anyway, Dorothea ends up, first she's in Hollywood, she spends the night there, and then she takes a Greyhound bus down to an area known as Westlake, or alternatively MacArthur Park, which is near downtown LA, but sort of situated between that and Echo Park for anyone who sort of knows the area. There's this really big, nice, beautiful lake nearby, but it's pretty overrun, unfortunately, with drug addicts and homeless people. And it hasn't been taken care of. It's been neglected by the city for years. So this has been a really rough area for a very long time, including when Dorothea was staying here. So the motels are super cheap. Nobody cares what your name is. So this worked out really well for her. She set herself up in a motel and got some dinner without being recognized. Her name and photo were all over the news and everybody was looking for her, but she had put herself into a predominantly Latino area, so she felt safe that people would basically just mind their own business. And for the most part, they did. After a couple of days, she decided to venture out, not because she felt safe necessarily, but because she needed to secure more money. She had a very finite amount. It was whatever she could shove into her purse that she had stolen from her victims. It wasn't like she herself was getting any money or could go cash a check under her name. So she decides to go out to a bar, the Monte Carlo, which, like the motel, which is called the Royal Viking, is still there today. And the Monte Carlo has some really wild reviews on Yelp. Honestly, it's mostly hipsters being angry that it's a real dive bar and not a curated fun one with updated amenities. But to me, it looks like just a good, rough dive bar. All the ones in downtown are gone. They've been gentrified. It's weird, but I feel like MacArthur Park and Westlake is one of the only areas that has truly stayed out of being gentrified. Somehow it's fought back. It's just not being turned into like a fucking Disneyland for like rich LA people. And I kind of love that. But it's super rough. So anyway, Dorothea goes out on November 16th, 1988, and she is on the prowl. She meets a man at this bar named Charles Wilgus and tells him her name is Donna Johansson. They get to talking and she finds out he's on Social Security and even tells him, oh, I can help you get more benefits. Like, we can work the system. Like, I'm really, I know what to do. And clearly she does. So after a while, she offers them to go out again and he accepts. She's like, well, let's get together on Thanksgiving. You shouldn't be alone. I'll come to your house and cook for you. And he's like, yeah, that sounds great. And so she's laying it on. And she even goes as far as to offer moving in together. She's like, why don't we share an apartment? Which is fucking crazy. They've been talking for like 2 hours. And Charles was not immediately into this, but he was open to seeing where things went. So they decided, okay, let's meet up this coming Thursday. If things go well, we'll keep hanging out. We'll do Thanksgiving. We'll see where it goes. She got him to buy her dinner to take with her back to her motel. And she goes back there to eat. And a few hours later, she gets a call from Charles. Apparently, he's just checking in with her. And he's like, oh, are you staying in for the night? She confirms, like, yes, I'm at room 31 at the Royal Viking Motel. I'm not going anywhere tonight. And I'm looking forward to seeing you on Thursday. So she's feeling really good. She's feeling like she's setting this up. She's got her next victim. Things are rolling. However, shortly after that phone call, there is a knock on Dorothea's door. She gets up and answers, and outside, looking straight into her room, are the police, who arrested her without incident. As it turns out, after leaving the bar, Charles, who had puzzled over where he had seen Donna, quote unquote, before, realized he had seen her on the news, or Dorothea Puente, rather, and that she was wanted for murder in Sacramento. After calling to confirm she'd be there, he called the police and led them right to her. Now, again, like I said, I'm not going to get into the details of the trial, but I will say that it was a bit of a circus with, I think, 150-something witnesses. Victims' families were involved. 3,100 pieces of evidence were introduced. I mean, it was crazy. Now, at first, Dorothea was charged only with the murder of Bert Montoya because that's kind of what kicked this whole thing off. But the list ended up growing to 9 people by the time she went to trial. Now, the trial started in February 1993, so almost 5 years later. Or just over 4, I guess. So it took a very long time for like the discovery phase and setting up the trial. And even though it started in February of 1993, it took all the way until August 26th of that same year to conclude, which is a very long trial. If anybody doesn't know, that's a long ass trial. And at the conclusion, Dorothea was found guilty of only 3 murders. The murder of Benjamin Fink, the murder of Leona Carpenter, and the murder of Dorothy Miller. The jury actually deadlocked on the other 6, which I find crazy. But again, I don't know all of the details. Now, although the death penalty was an option, I think due to her age and her cute little granny, the way she presents herself, the jury couldn't come to an agreement to put her to death. So instead, she was given life without parole. She was then moved to the Women's Center in Chowchilla, California, where she remained until her death at age 82. She died of natural causes. And that really is that, finally. This completes the tale of the murderous old lady, Dorothea Puente, and her house of horrors on F Street in Sacramento. Now, I've gone on Instagram and posted a picture of the house, which helps give you an idea of like the upstairs, downstairs, as well as some pictures of her victims and photos of Dorothea as well, both being free, although I think she's in court in the first picture, and her mugshot, which is particularly fun to look at. This lady was crazy. She is such an important part of true crime history and California history. She's pure evil. And I'm glad I covered the case, but I'm also glad to move on to something maybe a little less bulky for next week. So thanks everybody for listening in. I'm sorry if I'm sniffly or if I sound stuffy or if I mention anything twice. The flu has hit our house hard. I thought I had escaped its clutches, but I have not. So it's been a lot of time spent in bed. But some of that was recording this. So hopefully, you guys enjoy. And I'll be back next week with a whole new case. And thanks again, everybody, for listening. And until next week, stay safe.